doing this story and looking at it from an objective historical lens has taught me a lot.
I don't know that an objective historical lens exists. Hey guys, welcome back to the show. David here. So as of yesterday, there was a video published by a guy named Johnny Harris called The Real Story of the Mormon Church. So I'm going to react to it today. We won't be able to get to the entire thing. We'll probably just jump to the most relevant parts. It's a 40-minute video. I don't know how long this one's going to turn out to be, but since it was published yesterday, I've gotten multiple people coming and saying, hey, you should respond to this or react to it. So we're going to. Let's do it.
Joseph Smith. He's someone I know well. He's the author of a worldview that I held for most of my life.
Okay. I think we just need to take a moment here to talk about biases and recognize biases. Everyone is biased. I am biased. I'm a believing Latter-day Saint, and that probably is going to show through in some of the work I create. Johnny is apparently a former member of the church. He's going to be biased. That's probably going to show through in some of his work. I think it's just important to recognize that, so we kind of have our expectations set. Biases exist. You can't get around them. Sometimes we can try. But let's just recognize that going in. Let's keep going.
I taught it to hundreds of people when I was a missionary. It's a religion and a gospel that I deeply believed in. One full of hope and meaning and community. And unique stories. Stories about where we came from and where we're going.
I'm sorry, Johnny. That's rough. I'm sorry you went through that. I'm a returned missionary as well. I served in Mexico. I kind of feel like you're like my doppelganger in like the multiverse a little bit. We're both white guys with beards, RMs, things like that. But I'm sorry you went through that. Like, it's not hard to imagine that must have been really, really difficult. So, and you can tell from your video that it's been a really impactful, difficult journey for you. And I'm sorry that it didn't work out for you in the church. I sincerely hope you're doing better now. Let's talk about Joseph Smith.
Was born in the perfect place at the perfect time. It was the early 1800s, and the U.S. had just thrown off England to become a new country, and it was going through some massive growing pains. Most of these new Americans who had just left the old world rejected a lot of old world things, namely religion. Only 10% of white Americans regularly attended church at this time. This brand new country, founded on these new ideals, it was unprecedented times. America felt special and different, but also kind of scary. Revolution in the new world, new science, magical technology, new ideas, both wholesome and sinful, all of it speeding up at an increasing rate. For a lot of people, this was a sign that the end of the world was coming and that Jesus, like he prophesied, would come back to usher in this 1,000 years of glory for those who believed in him and 1,000 years of fire for those who didn't. This was
kind of seems like every generation thinks that the second coming is going to happen in their generation. I think even in the Bible, the apostles thought that Christ's second coming was pretty imminent, or I think that's a viewpoint of Paul in the New Testament that, hey, it's happening. That was one of the reasons why Paul spoke down about marriage a little bit, because he was just like, we don't have time. He's coming back. There's no time for things like that. But anyways, he's right though.
So a lot of these new churches that were cropping up kind of claimed to be the place that was preparing the earth for the second coming, like they were God's chosen administrators on the earth. And this is the context that Joseph Smith was born into in 1805, born to a mother who was swept up in the
That's not Lucy Mack Smith. That is Emma Smith, Joseph Smith's wife.
Excitement of all these new religions, and a father who wasn't really religious at all. It's kind of like a lot of people at the time, a family that was religiously lost, but not for long.
I don't know that I'd say that his entire family was religiously lost. His mother and some of his siblings were, I believe, happy Methodists. I did an episode on our channel about life in Palmyra. We can put the episode number up. I don't remember if it was Methodist or Presbyterian, but his family believed in God. It was just which church they were going to be a part of. That was the question. And several of them were members of a church.
In addition to being a frothy religious environment, upstate New York was also a place where people hunted for treasure. There was this culture of folk magic and legends that led to the search for riches and jewels that were potentially buried by Spanish explorers or pirates of the past, or artifacts that were hidden in Native American burial mounds. And their methods for hunting for all this treasure were mystical and magical. They used seer stones, crystals, rods, visions through dreams, all of this to help them locate buried treasure. And young Joseph Smith was very caught up in this treasure hunting craze.
I think the way that he's framing this magical tradition, I think it's a little bit outdated and a little bit misleading. And we've done an episode on this, but in it we go over the very recent research of an anthropologist who is not a member of our faith named Manuel Padro. And he's published a bunch of research about the treasure quest. What generally tends to happen when skeptics talk about the treasure quest is they'll kind of present two options. Either Joseph Smith was, he believed in magic and witchcraft and, the occult and things like that, which makes him very weird and other, or he didn't believe in it and he was actually just an outright fraud tricking people out of their money. Those are kind of the two only options that we're left with when talking about this tradition. But Manuel Padro shows this excellent research that essentially says, no, sincere participants in the treasure quest recognized that this was a very Christian activity. But the Christian idea behind this practice was that if you had treasure and you did not use it well, altruistically, if you buried it, and then you died before you were able to use it, then the spirit of that owner would be tied to that treasure. And it was the treasure hunter's job to find the treasure, dig it up, and use it altruistically, and that would free that spirit, that would liberate that spirit that had been attached to that treasure. And so in a way, this was the Christian salvation of the dead, if you want to look at it that way. And so it's important to recognize that this tradition is being framed in a way that Joseph and his family wouldn't have thought about it that way. The other thing that he touches on are the inanimate objects that are used in the treasure quest, rocks and sticks and stuff like that. That shouldn't be totally foreign to Christians. The Bible is full of instances of God using inanimate objects to bring about his purposes. You've got Moses throwing a stick on the ground that turns into a snake. You've got the Israelite high priest who has the Urim and Thummim, which are believed to be two stones that were revelatory tools for the high priest. Now, could people use those things fraudulently and lie about them? Of course. But to jump to the conclusion that that's what is happening when we see precedent for a righteous use of these things in the scriptures, I don't know that that's quite fair. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move forward.
He wasn't educated. He barely had any schooling. He could kind of read and write. He wasn't religious, but from a young age, he showed himself as a skilled treasure hunter. I mean, let's keep some perspective. In all of our research, we didn't find a single document showing that he actually found any treasure, but he managed to convey to the people around him that he was an expert treasure hunter using mythical methods.
Okay, so there we go, where he's kind of framed as a fraud, right? But to sincere treasure seekers, if you didn't find the treasure, it wasn't because you were a fraud, it was because it was protected. They did believe that because you were trying to do a righteous deed, you were trying to liberate a captive spirit, they believed in this tradition that Satan would try to stop you, that demons would try to stop you. But the question here is about the sincerity of Joseph in this practice. He's a teenager at this time, or maybe early 20s. The church hasn't been restored yet. The Book of Mormon hasn't been published yet. He's going to have traditions and beliefs that aren't in complete alignment with, the restoration today as we know it. So I'm less interested in whether or not this treasure hunting was effective and more interested in whether or not Joseph believed that it was a sincere endeavor or if he was just being a fraud. And I believe he was sincere.
This is the context that you need to know to really understand this story. We're in upstate New York in the early 1800s. There is this frenzy of folk magic and treasure hunting, and
folk Christianity is, I think, a better term for it. Folk magic would be what the majority would call it as a way to kind of push it away, push it down. But it was folk Christianity.
Joseph, a 14-year-old boy, gets curious about religion. And after visiting a bunch of churches and finding no answers, he decides to go into a grove of trees to ask God which church was true. He sees a pillar of light. He finds out that it's God the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. And Jesus goes on to tell him that none of the churches that he's been investigating are true, and that instead, Joseph is being called to do the work of God, to restore the real true church that had been lost from the earth. Joseph doesn't tell anyone about his vision, but by 1823, Joseph is a late teenager, and one night he's sleeping in his little humble cabin with his family, and he says that an angel appears to him. The angel is named Moroni. But for now, he's an angel in Joseph Smith's room, telling young Joseph that yes, the second coming of Christ is right around the corner, and that yes, just like God and Jesus told him a few years ago, he has been called to prepare the world for the second coming. And if that wasn't enough, Moroni tells him that there is a book that is written on golden plates that is buried in a hill near Joseph's house. In his 20s, he's this uneducated, unreligious treasure hunter, and he starts to focus in on something totally new. In the words of one believing Mormon historian, Richard Bushman, he starts to orient himself away from treasure and towards translation. He's becoming a prophet.
Okay, that was kind of creepy, the way they had Joseph Smith moving there. It seemed a little bit alien. I don't know if that's intentionally meant to portray him as something is off about this guy. Something is off about this guy. But that was kind of creepy. He's a puppet. That's so weird.
So Joseph says he goes and gets these plates, and people try to rob him, but eventually he gets them secured. And in a little cabin in rural New York, Joseph begins the work of translating this stack of metal plates that no one else is allowed to see.
That no one else is allowed to see. What about the dozen or so guys who said, yeah, I did see the plates. If you open the Book of Mormon, you're going to see in the first pages the testimony of the three witnesses, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery, and the testimony of the 8 witnesses. The 3 witnesses were presented the plates by an angel. They saw the angel, they saw the plates, and they testify of that. Later, they all leave the church for one reason or another. But throughout their lives, they never deny the veracity of their testimony. They stick to their testimony until they die. And Martin Harris ends up coming back to the church. Oliver Cowdery ends up coming back. David Whitmer has a split-off sect of the church. They believe in the Book of Mormon to their deaths. And they reiterate over and over and over again that even though they had a falling out with Joseph, they saw the plates. That is real. That was a reality for them. Same thing with the 8 witnesses. Several of them ended up separating from the church, but all of them stuck to their testimonies. And it seems like a massively glaring omission to leave that information out of this story of the Book of Mormon. Because the witnesses, you've got the 3 and the 8 official witnesses, and you have unofficial witnesses who had tangible, real experiences with the plates. And we don't hear about any of that. We're just kind of made to believe that nobody saw them. That's not accurate. Or if that is the route you want to go, you've got to find a way to explain these hundreds of documents that we have from people who don't seem to have a reason to lie about this, at least at different points in their life after separating from the church, when they could have used this as ammo to destroy Joseph Smith, but they don't. And that's a tough one for people to explain. And you look at the lives of these men, especially Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery's my boy. I like that guy. He was a great, great guy. And I don't believe that they were conspirators, co-conspirators with Joseph Smith. Some people think that they were hypnotized by Joseph Smith to see the plates. There are all these different explanations that people try to grasp onto, but I think they all fall short. The witnesses are a really, really large barrier for me personally. If I'm going to leave the church, that is a barrier that I need to deal with, that I need to grapple with. So I'm bummed that he didn't include that.
He would sit on one side of a curtain so that no one else could see. And he says he looked through these stones at the Egyptian engravings on these golden plates, and they would turn into English.
That was cool editing. I liked that. So this is an oversimplified account. There are some records, some accounts that say that there was a curtain or a screen in between him and his scribe, but there are lots of accounts that contradict that, that directly contradict that. In fact, his wife, let me pull it up, a quote from Emma Smith, Joseph's wife. "In writing for your father, I frequently wrote day after day, often sitting at the table close by him, he sitting with his face buried in his hat with the stone in it, and dictating hour after hour with nothing between us." Okay, so I don't know if this is intentional or not, but it kind of gives the impression like that he's hiding these more blatantly than he really was. Emma Smith, again, and others talk about, no, the plates were right there. They were wrapped up during the translation, and they weren't always right there. Sometimes they'd be in a different room. He didn't actually need the plates there because he was using his translation tool, the Urim and Thummim, or his personal seer stone, to receive the translation. But this is just a little historical detail that is not quite probably what it should be.
And then he would dictate them out loud to a scribe, sometimes his wife or other early believers who were supporting him. And that scribe would write them down. At other points, Joseph didn't even need the plates to translate. He could hide them somewhere else. And he would use his personal seer stone, the one that he used back when he was just a treasure hunter before he says he was called as a prophet. This little chocolate-colored egg-shaped stone. He would put it into a hat, and then he would bury his face in the hat. And he said that the stone would light up with the words that he was supposed to dictate to his scribe. His scribe would write it down, and the Book of Mormon was being written.
Yeah, so the seer stone, I mean, it's basically had the same purpose as the Urim and Thummim in this context. And yeah, people get thrown off by the hat thing, but the hat was just to block out ambient light that would seep in so that he could see what was on the stones. Now, what's really interesting is trying to figure out if Joseph was a fraud and the Book of Mormon isn't true, how the heck did he produce it? Like, what was he? Did he have a thick stack of notes in the bottom of that hat, or did he completely memorize it? Like, and again, he wasn't behind a screen at least most of the time. Based on the records that we have, people could see him. So where is this text coming from? Does he have just an amazing memory, or was he able to fool people, or were the scribes in on it? That's another question that is worth exploring. I think the clear answer is no. There's no way they were in on it. But anyways, we'll continue.
Now, listen, all of this seems really weird and wild to us now, very easily like, okay, clearly this guy's making it up. But at the time, mystical visions and treasure hunting and seer stones, this was all very normal in society. Folk magic, Native American artifacts, none of this was very fringe. And Joseph had been doing stuff like this for a decade, which is why his parents and other people in his community supported him. The difference, though...
He hadn't been translating ancient records for a decade. He'd probably been, doing some treasure quest stuff. We really don't even know how involved he was in that endeavor, because we don't have a ton of records saying, precisely with confidence what he was doing. But no, dictating a text, that was completely new for Joseph. And you got to wonder, if he was a fraud, where did he find the skill set to be able to do that? That's just, even Johnny here has mentioned, I think, multiple times that this wasn't a relatively uneducated farm boy. It's totally wild that he's coming up with this massive book in this short amount of time with his face in a hat. And it does sound weird. That's fine. But like, if he was a fraud, I'd love to know how he did it.
Joseph says that he gives the plates back to Moroni and then takes the manuscript of the pages to a printer. That's how we have the Book of Mormon. This is my Book of Mormon. Maps.
The Book of Mormon actually talks about why the plates are given back to Moroni. We talk about that, and non-believers say, oh, how convenient that Moroni took them back. But in the Book of Mormon, it actually says that he's going to take them back because there's a sealed portion of the book that was not to be translated at that time that he needed to preserve.
So the Book of Mormon is incredibly important to this story because it was the main validator for Joseph Smith in those early days and continues to be a foundational part for believers in the LDS faith. And yes, this book is definitely full of a lot of like full-blown copy and paste jobs from like the Bible, but...
Okay. So we've done a video about Bible passages showing up in the Book of Mormon, and we explore various reasons why the Bible shows up. it's quite a bit of an oversimplification to just kind of suggest that he copied and pasted the Bible. But you do learn in the beginning of the Book of Mormon that they take with them from Jerusalem what are called the brass plates, which contained a lot of what we have in the Old Testament of the Bible. So that's one reason why we have biblical passages showing up in the Book of Mormon. It's much more complicated than that, but there's a lot more in the Book of Mormon besides Bible passages. I think in the episode that I'm referring you to, if you include the Isaiah passages and the Sermon on the Mount, which are the Isaiah passages are clearly quoting, then I think like 14%, maybe generously, is of the Book of Mormon parallels with Bible passages. But if you remove the clearly quoted Isaiah passages and Sermon on the Mount, it's like 7%. And if you look at the New Testament quoting from the Old Testament, you actually get somewhat similar percentages. So it's not all that weird to find the amount that we do in the Book of Mormon.
There's also like a lot of really compelling stuff in here in terms of religious lessons, complex histories, nods back to like an understanding of Hebrew language and culture.
We've done several episodes about this. It is a massively complex book. It's extremely complex. It's got different timelines, different calendars, different civilizations, accurate kind of judge/courtroom scenes, ancient in an ancient context, ancient warfare, also accurate geography, geographical references throughout the Book of Mormon. It's really, if my personal feeling, this is my personal feeling, if it was a fraud, it should be a lot easier to detect from the text of the Book of Mormon. But anyways, others will disagree with that. But it's a complex book.
Okay, so let's be clear on what Joseph Smith said the Book of Mormon is. It's not what a lot of people say, which is like the Mormon Bible. The book tells the story of a group of Jews in Jerusalem in around 600 BC. They're told to leave the city before it gets destroyed. So they leave the city, they walk in the desert for a while, probably to like Oman, is what a lot of Mormons think.
I think he means Yemen, which is actually really interesting because there's in the old world there's a very plausible route that Lehi could have taken. The Book of Mormon talks about specific rivers and access to fruit and wood for building ships and all these different things, and you go through the Arabian Peninsula and it lines up actually quite nicely with what is actually there. It would have been quite difficult for Joseph Smith to know all of that about that area in the time that this was written.
And then they build a boat and travel across the ocean for a very long time until they reach the Americas, somewhere in like North, Central, or South America. The foundation of the story is about these brothers of the original family who like eventually split off and they like hate each other and they grow up into these two different civilizations, the Nephites and the Lamanites, who are always fighting with each other. And there's all these prophets and there's all this drama that happens. And the introduction to my Book of Mormon says the Lamanites, these people who came over from Jerusalem, are, quote, the principal ancestors of the American Indians. And
okay, so that, well, let's see what
a few years ago, they did change that to the Lamanites being among the ancestors of the American Indians.
Okay, so the introduction to the Book of Mormon was not part of the original purported ancient record, right? It's not technically part of the Book of Mormon. This introduction was added later. It's not a revealed text, so to speak. But I'm grateful to belong to a faith that is willing to adapt as new information comes along. So if they did think it was the principal ancestors of the American Indians, I'm fine with them as new information comes along. I'm fine with them changing it to among the ancestors of the American Indians.
But yeah, the point is that the Book of Mormon is a history of these Jews turned indigenous Americans. And unsurprisingly, there's a whole community of believers who work to validate that this is actually a historic record. But no, in reality, there's no archaeological, genetic, or linguistic evidence that supports the Book of Mormon's assertion that Jewish people migrated to the Americas around 600 BC.
Okay. What does that say? Fair LDS folks. I'll see you in the comments, Fair LDS folks. So Fair is an organization that kind of answers these kinds of questions. They're kind of viewed as the apologists of the church. And he's clearly nodding at the fact that he's going to get some pushback for this. And I think for good reason. Now, we've done a couple of videos on the question of archaeology and things like that, and so we won't talk about this a whole lot. But the way I see it, Old World archaeology and New World archaeology are two very different animals. They're two very different environments. So there are challenges that come with this question. But it is true that we have not found a big rock with the word Zarahemla chiseled into it yet. Interestingly, going back to Old World archaeology, talking about Lehi's route through the desert to the ocean, there is some fascinating stuff there. The Book of Mormon talks about a place called Nahom, where they stop for a little bit. And right where it should be, we've found a place called Nahom. And near this place, we learn that a guy in the Book of Mormon named Ishmael dies. And guess what we found near Nahom in the Old World? A literal gravestone has been found with the name Ishmael on it. Of course, it's in the language of the day. And it may or may not be the actual Ishmael of the Book of Mormon. We can't prove that. But there's some compelling research that does not prove that the Book of Mormon is true, but it makes it entirely plausible in several different respects. Now, this is going to be a battle that's going to be going on for the next 100 years. People are going to be arguing about this. Personally, I don't believe that we're going to be able to prove that the Book of Mormon is historically accurate in every sense. And I believe that because I think that when it comes to Scripture, there has to be room for faith. And God wants it to be a choice between believing or not. Because that tells God something about us that can't be told if we're being academically forced to believe something. But I will just say that there is a lot more going on with that than maybe Johnny is getting into. And I recognize that this is a relatively short video that he's producing, and it's not all about archaeology, but there's more to the story than what's being said here.
For believers, the most important part of this book is the climax of the whole thing, where in 33 AD, Jesus, having recently been crucified over in the Old World in Jerusalem, gets resurrected over there and comes to visit the people in America, which is where this painting came from. This is a painting that is hanging in a lot of LDS churches. It shows Jesus Christ among the ancient civilizations of the Americas. Yeah. Some pretty wild stories.
It's wild enough that you'd really want to know if it's true or not. Like, look pretty closely at that story and give it your due diligence, because if it is true, it's a big deal.
So yeah, I know we're all over the place, and we'll get back to Joseph Smith's life for a second, but as someone who has read this book dozens of times, I can tell you that when you're a believer, this is a really compelling piece of work. You can read these pages, and you can read about the stories and the lessons and the metaphors, and you can take a lot from it. And the biggest thing that you take from it is that it is proof that Joseph Smith was actually called of God to prepare the world for the second coming, that he was a legitimate prophet.
I don't know that I'd say that it proves that Joseph was a prophet, but I would say that it is supporting evidence in favor of the notion that he was a prophet of God. Because again, I don't think that you can prove these things, but it definitely helps.
So, Joseph Smith, by 1830, has the Book of Mormon, he has proof that he's a prophet, and he starts to gain followers. Followers that believe him, and a group of those followers get together in April of 1830 in a little house in Fayette, New York.
Puppet motion again.
And they start a church. At this point, Joseph Smith is behaving like a full-blown prophet. He says he's getting almost daily communication from Jesus, and he starts to develop a theology that is unlike anything else on offer. Turns out that God is actually a man with a body of flesh and bone, and he has a wife.
So this is in contrast with kind of traditional Christianity, which asserts that God is immaterial, that he is not made of physical matter, that he does not have a body, he does not have form. It's hard to grasp what he is, but those are the things that he is not. And Latter-day Saints we're made in his image. He has a physical, perfected and glorified body of flesh and bone. We are different in degree, but not kind. Which I love that doctrine of our faith. It makes God much more real and personal to me personally. But yes, that is something we believe.
God lives near a star that's far away.
Okay, so we know like nothing about Kolob. We've got that hymn about it, which is so weird, and I wouldn't mind if they got rid of it in hymn book. But we don't know hardly anything about this. We don't know if God lives on it, or if he lives near it, or there are some Latter-day Saints who believe that it's not even a literal place and that it's just a symbol for Jesus Christ. But critics get a lot of mileage out of it because it makes us seem really weird.
Our heavenly parents have birthed us into spiritual children, and then they sent us down onto this earth to get a physical body, to get married, to create an earthly family, to learn and to grow. We have to complete certain rituals and demonstrate obedience to him. And in order to make this all happen, he needs to set up a church. The church needs to have proper authority, and there would need to be a savior that would come down to account for all of our sins so that we can be pure to enter the kingdom of God again. Okay, but there's a big problem, which is that God's children are super rebellious. So over the years, God calls prophets to organize his church with the proper authority and to do all of these special rituals to teach them about Jesus.
Okay, he keeps mentioning these special rituals. Makes us sound kind of weird. We refer to these as ordinances. An ordinance you might be familiar with would be baptism. That's one of these rituals that he's talking about. Coupled with these ordinances are covenants or promises with God. It's not so much about the action of the ritual. It's about the covenant relationship that comes about because of these ordinances. If you go through these rituals or ordinances, but you don't stay loyal to God and keep the promises that you make with him, then doing the ritual, that's not going to matter at all.
But a lot of this stuff was totally new, wild fringe doctrine. God has a body and a wife? This was a completely wild blend of Jewish mysticism, American folk magic, reincarnation, evangelical Christianity.
There's that American folk magic. It's folk Christianity. I just gotta say it.
And eventually he even wove in Freemasonry, a totally fresh thing. There was nothing quite like it. It was super unique and super potent and super polarizing. You either believed that Joseph Smith was an incredibly inspired prophet who was like revealing the truth that none of us had ever heard before, or he was just a brilliant creative visionary inventing this elaborate plan to dupe people, which is what a lot of people in his village started to think as he started to gain followers. They had him arrested, calling him a disorderly person.
It's actually interesting. We did a video on kind of the evolution of what people believed about Joseph Smith. And it's so interesting because at the beginning, in the early stages of the Restoration, they're like, oh, Joseph Smith made this book up. He's a fraud. And then they start reading the book and they realize, okay, this is actually really complex. And I don't think that Joseph could have done this on his own because he's too stupid. And you look at the records and they insult Joseph up and down. Like, he's uneducated. He couldn't have done this. And so then they start shifting to these other theories that, oh, he had access to the Solomon Spaulding unpublished manuscript, and that's where he took all this material from, and all these different things. And now today, I feel like, because a lot of those previous theories have been largely debunked, now we're trending back towards, okay, actually Joseph did write this book, but not in the same way as the early people believed. Now, instead of an idiot, Joseph is actually really, really smart and really skilled. And behind the scenes, somehow he's been gleaning information from all these different sources. We've talked about some of them in our other videos, other books, the View of the Hebrews, the Late War, the First Book of Napoleon, the Golden Pot. Some people even say Hamlet. The Travels of Marco Polo is another one. The list goes on and on. Joseph all of a sudden has this secret library of books that he's taking information from and synthesizing seamlessly into the Book of Mormon in this short, as Johnny mentioned, 90-day period, which is actually even shorter when you account for travel days and things like that. And so it's fascinating how the idea of how Joseph accomplished it has changed. And it's interesting that in this video, while kind of repeatedly suggesting that Joseph was a fraud, Johnny doesn't seem, at least yet, to give us the true story, right? Or according to him, at least, like how the Book of Mormon came to be. This text, these 588 pages, they came from somewhere. So I'm interested to see if he's going to put forward a theory or just kind of leave that hanging in the air.
Eventually gets released, and he realizes that he and his few members need to leave. This begins the long journey of the Mormons moving west. Joseph and his followers set out. He's now talking to God directly all of the time, and
Okay. He's now talking to God directly all of the time. No, that I don't think that's an accurate characterization. He is receiving revelations from time to time, but also Latter-day Saints don't believe that him receiving a revelation means that he sat down for tea and crumpets with God, and God said, here you go, like, here's this revelation, go publish it. It's not that simple, and we could talk more about that, but I don't know if that's an accurate characterization.
he says that the Lord is telling him to go to Ohio to await instructions for their actual final destination, the place that they're actually going to set up their new city, their millennial kingdom, this communal utopian society that would be the base for preparing the world for the second coming of Jesus. They would call it Zion. A new communal society where everyone would share with one another, the resources would be shared, and the whole thing would be governed by celestial laws and governmental structures. A new government run by the prophet, where God could talk to his people while he prepared the world for its end. The locals in Ohio and their government don't love this vision of a new religious society. The flocks of new members of the church arriving to this super well-organized, efficient, unified group of people led by this charismatic prophet who has more and more fringe beliefs. One night, Joseph is violently dragged from his home by a mob. He's covered in tar and feathers. They're telling him to leave, and he does. Luckily, one of Joseph's missionaries and former scribes, Oliver Cowdery,
that's my boy,
had been out scouting where Zion should be, where the millennial kingdom should be set up. And he comes back and says he found the place. Jackson County, Missouri, 800 miles away. Indeed, and just as the Lord said, right on the border with the Lamanites. This would be Zion, the Lord tells Joseph, the place where he has appointed for the gathering of the saints. But not so fast. The locals, are not into this. They hear about this swarm of Mormons coming to their county who want to turn their city into a new religious communal society and prepare for the apocalypse. And now they're arriving by the thousands, which means they will have more political power soon. They start to get scared that the Mormons are plotting a takeover of their private property, all in the name of building Zion, and they're not going to stand for it. They want the Mormons out.
See, why would Latter-day Saints do that? Like, they know they're the minority. Like, they know they need to keep their shoes clean, or else they're going to cause problems. Yeah. Did problems arise? They did.
The next 5 years are years of conflict for Joseph and his growing church. They're on the move all over the Midwest, at each stop facing violent resistance from local residents and government officials. So Joseph and his followers are done being passive. They start fighting back, and it escalates into basically a full-blown war. The governor of Missouri issues a literal extermination order, saying, quote, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for public peace. It's getting really bad. So they flee once more to Illinois, where the government, who includes a young lawmaker named Abraham Lincoln, gives them a special charter to create a city and a government that is fit for their unique Zion principles. They call this city Nauvoo, Hebrew for beautiful or beautiful place. A city that eventually grew to be more populous than Chicago. And it's in Nauvoo where Joseph says that an angel appeared to him and demanded multiple times against his will that he take on multiple wives. Those wives are sealed to him. His first plural marriage is to a teenager, and he goes on to have 40 wives in just 3 years. Many of them were married to other people, but then were sealed to Joseph, the prophet.
Okay, we've done an episode on a lot of questions about plural marriage, specifically the one where he's claiming that women were married to other men, and things like that. So you can go watch those episodes. We'll put them up on the screen. If you really want to dive deep into this stuff, go read Brian Hale's 3-volume set and come to your own conclusions on these things. There's some really interesting research, though, coming out. This is very recent stuff at a conference like last week, as of the time we're filming this. And it's by Don Bradley. We've had him on our show before. He was a member of the church, and then he left the church. And then he came back to the church, and it's a fascinating story, but he knows probably more about plural marriage than anyone else on the planet. Next to Brian Hales, maybe. Don Bradley actually helped with that 3-volume set. But he presented some research in which he notices a pattern when it comes to the early years of Nauvoo polygamy, where it seems that Joseph is intentionally taking as wives women who are pregnant at the time, which is a fascinating detail because at that time, culturally, you would not be intimate with a woman that was already pregnant. So it looks like he's specifically choosing women that he would not have to be intimate with, but that he would also be able to fulfill at the same time one of the reasons for plural marriage, which was in part to have kids, to raise up seed, to create a people for God. So he thought, or at least it seems that he was thinking, hey, these women are already pregnant. I'll just marry them. We won't have to have an intimate relationship, but I can still, say that, hey, look at the kids and look, we're fulfilling the command. That pattern does not last forever, but it's there and it's interesting. And I'm looking forward to seeing what additional research comes out regarding that. But yeah, tough topic all around. Valid questions about plural marriage.
What I find striking here is that up until this point, you have this meticulous documentation of every single revelation and theology rule.
Okay, I don't know that that's quite true. Joseph Smith was not the best record keeper. He does get better as time goes on, but to say that, they had these amazing records of every, I don't know that that's true.
And new policy in the church here in what's called the Doctrine and Covenants. But polygamy stayed quiet and private. It was one of those revelations reserved for just Joseph and the leaders that he chose. By 1844, the Zion dream is actually catching fire. It's growing in Illinois, and Joseph decides to run for president. Now, he didn't have a big chance of winning, but in his mind and the mind of his followers, this was the natural next step. They were establishing Zion, and Zion was going to be the new society on earth.
And his followers also didn't really have other great options. The other candidates, as far as I'm aware, if I recall correctly, were not friendly towards the saints. So they were like, well, who do we vote for? And so Joseph, one of the reasons why he runs for president is to give them somebody that they can root for.
But this presidential campaign miserably backfires because now he is seen as a legitimate political threat. He's too good at gaining new followers. It gets worse when one group of former Latter-day Saints who didn't agree with Joseph decide to publish a newspaper in Nauvoo that criticized him.
We've done an episode on this as well.
And generally his leadership. Joseph is done messing around at this point. He's become very militant, and he responds by sending his militia to destroy their printing press. He declares martial law. And
so that is true that he did. He was part of the decision to destroy that printing press. Nobody really seems to talk about when the Saints printing press was destroyed at an earlier date, and nothing ever happened to the people who did that. So I agree that it was a mistake for him to go destroy the press, but in context, like, it had been done to the Saints and nobody did anything about it.
Now the government of Illinois, who had given them this sort of safe charter, sees this chaos and they're not into it. And they arrest Joseph for attempting to incite a riot. Now, this was one of many run-ins with the law that Joseph Smith had. I didn't cover them. Some of them were legitimate, some of them were trumped up, but now he's caused a real disruption. He gets locked up in jail, and 2 days later, a mob of more than 200 men storm this jail. They climb up to the second floor where Joseph and his brother are, and they shoot at him. He tries to jump out the window, and he falls to his death. This poured fuel on the fire of his vision for Zion. But the Latter-day Saints start to realize that if they're going to build Zion, it's not going to be in the United States. So they look far to the west, to Mexico. And the next chapter of the story is the move into Mexico and the establishment of their Zion. But for now, I want to just tell you my thoughts on Joseph Smith. As someone who spent most of my life believing this story, basing my life and my worldview around it. Doing this story and looking at it from an objective historical lens has taught me a lot.
Looking at it from an objective historical lens, I would refer you back to the beginning of the video when we talked about biases. I don't know that an objective historical lens exists.
Joseph Smith created something really powerful. You can't deny that. It was a story about the last days. It was a story full of treasure and visions and angels and modern-day revelation from God.
It wasn't really a story about treasure. I mean, the angel Moroni kind of made a point to Joseph Smith saying, "Hey, I know you think this is treasure, but this is not treasure. Don't treat it like treasure. If you do, you're not going to be able to keep it." It was treated as an ancient record, I think.
The problem with getting caught up in the beauty and the comfort and the narrative of being a chosen people in the last days is that it allows you to ignore. I think that's what a lot of people have done over the decades with Joseph's story. They ignore something that I guess is plain for me to see now on the other side of this.
That's plain for me to see now. It kind of gives you the impression that, I don't know, if you've seen our channel, just look at some of our videos. Like, I hope it becomes clear that there are a lot of members of the church, believing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who are not burying their head in the sand when it comes to the story of Joseph Smith and the challenges that come along with it and the beautiful aspects of that story as well. I believe that there is reason for faith when it comes to the church. I don't believe that it can be proven one way or the other, but I think that there's plenty of evidence supporting the notion that we should have faith in this. I think sometimes what bothers me about these kinds of videos that explain the history of my faith from the perspective of someone who has left the faith is that there's this idea that, once you leave, then you are enlightened and everything becomes clear. And, I was just indoctrinated back when I believed this stuff. And I don't think that that's a fair thing to say. I don't think that's a fair box to put people in. Again, I think I'm looking at all the same information that Johnny is. We've just come to very different conclusions about what it means. And that's okay. And that doesn't make Johnny a bad person. And hopefully our viewers don't think that makes me a bad person or a dupe. But good people can look at the same information and come to different conclusions and agree to disagree sometimes. That's okay. I'm willing to do that.
Joseph Smith was a charismatic leader who knew how to tell stories about magic, about visions, and about treasure. He had known how to do that since he was a teenager, well before he decided he was going to become a prophet. He found an audience in doing this. He attracted people to him with his visionary skills, and he used those skills to invent a complex set of stories about Native Americans actually being Israelites, about heavenly parents preparing the world for its end, and about the priesthood, this authority that we all must participate in to receive the rituals and ordinances that only one church can administer.
Okay, so he's talking about these skills that Joseph developed in order to create this complex book. But I feel like that hasn't really been addressed in this video. What skills would be needed to write a complex, almost 600-page book in that amount of time without the aid of notes or reference material? What kind of skills would you need for that? And then juxtapose that with the skills that we know Joseph had or didn't have. When I look at those two things, I see a vast gap in between the two. And that gap has not been filled in for me in this video. And that is a major hurdle that I think needs to be addressed. And what I've seen so far, for almost 200 years now, critics of the faith have been trying to fill that gap in. And from what I've seen, there has been no consensus. Again, people have jumped from plagiarizing from the Bible to the Spalding manuscript to the View of the Hebrews to all these different things, to Oliver Cowdery was secretly in on it and his family was in on it and all these different things. But there's no consensus. The evidence does not support any one of these theories. And the Book of Mormon is a marvel. If Joseph was not a prophet, explain to me how this book exists. Where did this text come from? Where did First Nephi come from? Where does Second Nephi come from? These stories, where did they come from? How did he write them? How did he dictate them with his face in a hat and dupe all these people? That's a question that I don't see answered here. I feel like he's just kind of jumped to the conclusion that, oh, it was a fraud. He was a fraud. But he's not telling me how. I understand, though, that this is a very emotional thing for Johnny, and I do feel for the guy. And again, I can't prove that it's true, and I respect everyone's choice to choose between whether or not they're going to believe it. And he's chosen not to believe it, and that's okay, and I'm not going to judge him for it. But I don't know that it's fair to kind of omit these very big questions that I think are needing to be answered.
And eventually he used these stories to build a movement around his vision that allowed him to take 40 wives and build an army and break laws and bully his enemies. When you are a Latter-day Saint, these...
I'm not going to say that the saints were perfect in their treatment of their enemies. But also, let's not forget that the saints were not particularly treated well either.
Facts are written off as anti-Mormon literature or persecution. But for me, having left the church and spent years rewiring my brain and my programming of these stories.
Okay, there it is. The assumption that, we've all been programmed, right? That we're all a part of a cult, and that we're all under mind control and have been indoctrinated. And I mean, I just don't think it's a great thing to categorize people like that. I think it's self-serving to say about anyone who disagrees with you, oh, they're programmed that way, like they've been indoctrinated. I think that that's an easy way to shrug off some of these big questions and not address. I feel like he's not addressing a lot of the reasons that people stay. We don't hear about a lot of those things. But again, I respect the guy.
I see them as facts. And frankly, they're not that surprising.
See, and I don't see them... I don't think that's the way history works. The documents are the documents, like the sources are the sources, but the way you interpret those, like everyone has to interpret them. He's interpreting them a certain way. I interpret them very differently most of the time, it seems, than he does. And that's okay. But to say like, oh, it's a fact that Joseph was a fraud, I don't think that you can make that statement. You can make it, but I don't know that it's true.
This is the same old story of a charismatic, visionary man who tells a story of apocalyptic endings to gain followers, to gain power, and then decides that he deserves a lot of women, and then he dies for the cause, leaving a movement that continues his vision. Oftentimes those movements get more and more dogmatic. They use shame to keep their people close to them, and they revere their prophet long after that prophet is dead. And yet, what's complicated about this is I can't help but feel a deep sense of sadness for having lost my belief in Joseph's story. I can't explain it, but these stories are incredibly comforting when you believe in them. They are motivating. These creative stories, unlike any other belief system, can be really beautiful. And that is a paradox that there's really no resolution for.
Bruce and Marie Hafen talk about this process of spiritual growth. We've done an episode on it, and it's a 3-stage process. You start with the first stage, which is simplicity, where everything is hunky-dory. It's a very idealistic worldview. And then you move on to complexity, where you start to dive a little deeper, and everything isn't quite as perfect and hunky-dory as you thought it would be. And the third stage is simplicity beyond complexity, when you grapple with the hard stuff, come to terms with it, and you still kind of find some simplicity at the end of it all. You see this process with religion, you see it with studying history in different cultures, you see it in math, as we grow from the basics of addition and subtraction to more complex formulas. Everybody, I think, in any faith is going to start off with a very simplistic understanding of their faith. I certainly have in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Then you get exposed to complexity, which is especially prolific in today's world of social media. you get exposed to complexity. You learn about plural marriage and race in the priesthood and all these different issues that critics talk about, and they're hard. It can be very hard, and I'm not going to judge people if they stop at complexity and say, this is too much. I can't do it. I'm not doing it. I'm gone. And it seems like that is where Johnny is coming from, that he hit that complexity and it was too much. And that's okay. Again, there's going to be complexity. But I hope that those that are currently experiencing the stage of complexity, I hope that you will press forward and keep digging and keep looking and see if you can come to a place of simplicity beyond complexity. Hopefully our channel helps you with that as you look at the videos we've done about lots of these historic issues and challenges, because getting to this place, it's a beautiful place to be, and it's a really humbling place to be. And it's a place where gratitude is growing, and a place where we can recognize the humanity of our leaders and mistakes that have been made in the past, but still see the divine throughout this narrative, throughout this story. It's a wonderful place to be, and that would be the advice that I would give to those watching. Keep looking. It's one thing to be told the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by someone who has left the faith, versus someone who is still an active believer. I feel for Johnny. I do. I'm Johnny, if you're watching this, I'm so sorry that you have gone through this. It's clearly been very difficult for you. And you seem like a sincere guy, and I wish you the best. And I will say that overall, this wasn't a terrible video. I've seen much worse from critics or former members of our church. A lot of it was great. A lot of it did seem skewed and biased or inaccurate or incomplete. I recognize that that's sometimes inevitable when it comes to a short video. But overall, I thought that this was good. The production value was fantastic. Johnny is obviously a great host. I disagree with his conclusions, and that's okay. We can still be friends. We can still be good people. And thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.